Why should we eat high sulfur foods, and which foods have high sulfur?
Yeah, sulfur is my big thing. And that's actually where I started in my research journey, was realizing that autistic kids, suffer from sulfate issues, sulfate deficiencies, as well as sulfur deficiencies and impaired sulfur metabolism. And I think that's true for many different diseases, that they're connected to a sulfur dysbiosis, I could call it, so I've looked hard at that with respect to glyphosate. Again, I have at least one chapter on sulfur in my book. I talk a lot about how important I think sulfate is to the body's, to much about the body's metabolism, and how sulfate is disrupted in multiple ways by glyphosate. Glyphosate impairs sulfate synthesis, sulfate transport, sulfate transfer from one molecule to another. Just about everything about sulfate gets disrupted by glyphosate. And so when you have a systemic sulfate deficiency problem, then you have a problem with insufficient structured water. And this is a fascinating field that has been developed by Jerry Pollack. It's been popularized by Jerry Pollack, professor in water. His field of expertise is water, and it's a really that fascinating topic. And water has this gelled form. If you look at Jell-O, that's gelled water. And it's the sulfates that populate, that, for example, line all the blood vessels of your body are lined with the sulfated glycosaminoglycans that create the structured water that houses it coats the interior of the blood vessel and protects it from everything that's in the blood. So you're basically building a shield. And it also produces a very slick layer so the red blood cells can slide through with limited, very little friction. So it promotes blood circulation. And it also produces this negative charge, which has a good effect as well. So there's all these, and it creates an electrical circuit, which is really fascinating. Gerald Pollack talks about how the gel that's created by those sulfate molecules, the gelled water actually releases protons. It pushes them out and creates a battery that at the barrier, at the boundary between the gelled water and the fluid water that's the flowing blood. And then those protons are then able to be ushered into the cell to generate electrical supply for the cell. So when you have insufficient sulfate, you also have insufficient electrical circuitry supplying your tissues, which of course is essentially an energy problem, energy deficiency problem.
Aside from glyphosate, are you concerned that other chemicals and pesticides are harming our health?
Absolutely. And there's such a huge list. It's just daunting, actually, when you look at all of the things. A lot of the insecticides are very toxic. There are many drugs that are toxic, and plastics and PCBs. I mean, there's just a huge list. And then, of course, toxic metals like aluminum, mercury. The vaccines, I think, are a huge issue. And so we're just completely overloaded with all kinds of toxic chemicals in our daily lives. And it's caught up with us. I mean, it's just, we're not going to be a healthy society until we turn that around. I think we really have to be very aggressive in changing our policy. The governments need to be aggressive in changing the policy towards all of these chemicals to be, instead of saying they're perfectly safe until proven otherwise, you have to use extreme caution with any new chemical, because you can just have enormous consequences that are long-term that you never would have thought of, that will show up, that you'll finally figure out decades later after tremendous damage has been done. This is happening over and over again. Certainly DDT is a good story, and it's just this DDT repeating itself over and over again.
What are your thoughts on the pharmaceutical industry?
I have not met a pharmaceutical drug that I like. Let me put it that way. I think it's just really, really heartbreaking that Rockefeller and the whole story with oil, and how they just dismantled all of in the schools, all of the educational framework that was teaching what is now called alternative medicine, which is really traditional medicine founded on natural products. And we need to go back to that. We need to return to that form of medicine, because I think that pharmaceutical medicines are miserable failure. And I know so many that I just find very disturbing to me. I mean, one is certainly statin drugs, and I've written a lot about statin drugs, and it just pains me to see all these people who, I see them at the airports, when I go to the airport, and people who are walking with a walker, or they're obviously limping, or they're in pain, and their back is, they just can hardly stand to walk because they're in so much pain. muscle pain and brain fog and muscle weakness. All of these things are side effects of statin drugs. Basically, they make you grow older faster. And people's, my doctor says I have to take it, so I take it. I mean, I can't understand that kind of mentality. We need to understand that our doctor is not God, and that if patients need to do their own research before they take any drug that their doctor prescribes, because most of the drugs have nasty, nasty side effects, and some of them don't show up until many years later. So it's insidious. A lot of them are insidious in their destruction of your body's natural mechanisms.
What's happened when you've reported your research to the scientific community?
Which scientific community? It's been a struggle. I have had a lot of interesting stories about papers that I tried to get published and ran into trouble because probably because I'm being tracked by the pharmaceutical industry or the Monsanto type of people who are making sure that what I want to say doesn't get heard. And so it's a very frustrating effort to get a paper published. And I learned the hard way. Recently I had a paper that was invited paper for a special issue of a journal. And and it was perfect. And I collaborated with one of my best buddies for collaboration. We wrote, I thought, a really nice paper. We submitted it. And very shortly after we submitted it, we got back a letter that said it was rejected without review. And so we were quite shocked because the guy was encouraging us to submit and we didn't understand what had happened. And so we reached out to him and said, what's going on here? And his answer really shocked us because he said, I did not know that it was rejected. I did not know that it was rejected. So it had been taken upstairs and they had made that policy decision before he even got a chance to do anything with it. So that's the kind of thing we're up against. I mean, we did get that paper published in a different journal and it was well received, but that's the struggle you do. We had another one I wrote a long time ago with one of my students on statin drugs and arguing that statin drugs could explain there's a lot of downward health spiral among middle-aged men. And we looked at a database of health side effect reports, drug side effect reports, which was a very interesting topic. And you find all kinds of amazing things that way. But we correlated the drug side effect reports with the statin drugs with these middle-aged men and came up with a story that I thought was quite compelling. We had 3 reviewers. It came back and it was looking good. They had some comments. They were good. We fixed them. We sent it back for second, submitted our solution to those reviews. And then it came back again with a 4th reviewer who absolutely hated it and wrote huge pages of complaints about this and that and the other. So we very carefully answered all of his complaints. He wrote this long reply to this 4th reviewer, and then he still rejected it. We couldn't get past that 4th reviewer, and then it ended up that the journal rejected it as well. So they pull in someone when they find out the industry. I think you don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but that would be my assumption that they recognized they didn't want that paper published. They pulled in someone last minute and got it squashed. So this is the kind of thing I'm up against. It's a real struggle to write papers. I've been very happy with the open access, I guess it's called, papers, journals. And there's many of these journals sprouting up all over the place, and they don't have the reputation. They always talk about impact factor, and the mainstream likes to think that they're not relevant, they're not important. But the fact is they get out on the web and anybody can read them. You don't have to pay $40. I mean, there's actually a lot of features in these. And I find some of the most interesting articles are coming out of that alternative community because they're not straitjacketed the way the mainstream is in terms of what they can say.